Thanks for joining us this afternoon. So Laura, I believe the last time we met up was a few months ago at the White House, actually. And a lot has changed since then.
Yes.
So you were working at the White House. Can you tell everyone a little bit about what you were doing there, and then how that relates to the diversity and tech work that you're doing right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I spent 6 months, the last 6 months of the Obama administration, in DC at the White House. I had never intended to work in federal government. But I was invited by Megan Smith, who was at the time U.S. Chief Technology Officer, actually first to join her on stage at South by Southwest to talk about issues of gender representation and race representation in Silicon Valley, with 2 other women following the release of a report on sort of the state of these sorts of issues. And when we got off stage, Megan said, I think you should come and take a break from Code2040 and do this type of work at the White House. And really what she was doing already internally was championing representation in tech as one of President Obama's priorities around creating more equity and access in the economy. So I ended up moving to DC for 6 months and spending that time working on mainly 2 different buckets. One was workforce diversity, looking at federal workforce and technology companies in the tech sector. What is it that companies can and should be doing in order to create more equity and representation within their ranks? And then the second piece was around entrepreneurship and access to capital. So looking at the figures around who receives venture funding and equity funding for their startups, and thinking about how we could create more equity, so more Black and Latinx and other underrepresented founders could gain access to the startup capital that they need to start and build their companies. So I sort of split my time between those 2 areas of focus.
And of the work that you did while at the White House, how much of that do you think is still kind of like in place right now?
So the answer is all of it, but not necessarily at the White House. So the way that we thought about using both the kind of platform of the White House, but also the time that we had there. So I joined at kind of an interesting time because my last day was President Obama's last day, and I knew that going into it. So I knew that the priorities of the administration would change over no matter who took the baton come Inauguration Day. And so when we were thinking about issues like workforce diversity, we thought deliberately about how do we make sure that we're getting this outside of government and into the world so that companies can pick up the baton, so that venture firms can learn from this, so that we're not holding this as government information, but we're sort of setting it free. And similarly, with the access to capital work and the entrepreneurship work, I partnered really heavily with the Department of Commerce, Economic Development Administration, the Small Business Administration, which are all agencies, not to get too wonky, but most of the folks who work in government agencies actually stay throughout a transition, unlike most of the folks who work in the White House who serve at the pleasure of the president and come and go with a transition. So a lot of the folks that I worked with, actually particularly on the entrepreneurship work and access to capital work, are still working on similar issues in government right now.
So between tech companies speaking out against President Trump right now, and then kind of what we've seen happening with Uber in the last few days, with a former engineer alleging sexual harassment at the company, there's a lot going on just kind of in our space right now, and like particularly in the 2 spaces that you've been spending a lot of your time in. I guess I'm wondering, like, how how is it that you're looking at these issues, and are they intersecting in some way? Are they within the same bucket of, okay, like diversity and equity and justice in tech, or are they kind of separate?
Yeah, I think that's a good question because it can feel kind of overwhelming a lot of the time. Like there's so many things kind of coming at you in this space. The way we think about it at Code2040 is that these are not all isolated incidents. What we're looking at is really a systems level challenge. There's a lot of history that has been written and told by people who are way more expert than I am around sort of how we got to where we are, around the presence of systemic racism and sexism and plenty of other isms in our country. And because of that, this manifests in a number of different ways. So it can look like vast underrepresentation of different groups in tech. It can look like the types of funding numbers that we see where 1% of venture dollars go to African American and Latinx founders. It can look like sexual harassment and bias. And those are some of the ways that it's manifesting kind of in our sector, but really what we're talking about here is work and economics, and there's a lot of kind of social elements to this as well. There's political elements to this as well. So the way we see it at Code2040, all of these issues around the immigration ban, Black Lives Matter movement, those are all tied to what it means to think about and talk about diversity in tech, because the causes are coming from a lot of the same places. It's just being manifest in a border issue or a police brutality issue or an economic access issue. And so actually understanding all of these facets of the movement is critical to be able to move the needle when we're talking about what we mostly talk about at Code2040, which is diversity in tech, access to capital, representation in companies, and economic equity.
So it's interesting that you say that a lot of these things kind of fall into the bucket of diversity in tech. I know at some point last year, Reverend Jesse Jackson called the diversity in tech movement the civil rights movement of our time. And upon thinking about that recently, I've been wondering, like, is that still true given everything else that is going on in this world right now? Like, is diversity in tech the thing that's a civil rights movement of our time? And I mean, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, so the way I think about it is that it's the economic component of the civil rights movement. If you think about kind of power in our society, we live in a capitalist society, and a lot of power is very highly correlated with wealth. And so in order for communities to have, in many cases, political power or social power, they have to have economic power. And tech is increasingly a driver of economic opportunity. You look at sort of the snapshot today, and diversity in tech can feel like maybe it's a little bit niche. We're talking about that because we're here in Silicon Valley. But if you start to look at the trends in the economy and the fact that more and more companies are becoming more and more not just reliant on, but driven by tech, their tech workforce, the tools, the way that we are communicating with one another is increasingly moderated and mediated by technological products and platforms. You start to see how, as we move through time, that tech becomes not just sort of a niche in the economy, but an overall driver of the economy. And then you look at who is included and who's excluded from tech today and follow those trend lines, and you can easily see how, without solving for diversity in tech, we start to, as opposed to narrowing, we actually start to widen the economic equity gap in this country, which then leads to more social inequities, more inequities, political inequities, because we're essentially shutting folks out of the economy, which is where many people get a lot of their power.
So there are a lot of different ways to tackle diversity in tech. It could be from the perspective of the startup founder who's looking to build out that core team. It could look like, like the VCs and which startups they're funding. Do you think that one's maybe more important than the other, or are these things that we should be tackling simultaneously?
I think they're all critical for the sector. At Code2040, we take a multi-pronged approach. So we have our Fellows program, which helps to connect top Black and Latinx engineering talent with opportunities in the sector at our partner companies. We work directly with our partner companies on their hiring, vetting, management, retention, to move the needle on what existing companies look like. But we also work with entrepreneurs. So we have, in partnership with Google for Entrepreneurs, an entrepreneur in residence program in 8 cities around the country. We'll be announcing who those entrepreneurs are in the next couple weeks, so stay tuned. And that is looking at how we support first-time entrepreneurs and help them to build equitable companies that also are inspiration for others in their cities around the country. One of the things that we think about a lot with that program is how in Silicon Valley, a lot of what we're doing is sort of retrofitting existing companies and an existing ecosystem. And in a lot of the places where we're working around the country in these 8 cities, there's opportunity to actually build from scratch and change the way the makeup of the ecosystem looks before we're 30 years in. So I think all of these facets are really important. The question is, where are you situated and where are you kind of best equipped to make a difference, rather than which is the most important issue to work on?
Sometimes when I'll talk to tech CEOs or founders, and I'll ask them, why haven't you released a diversity report? And a lot of times the answer is like, well, we're a pretty small company. Like, don't you think it's too early for us to release one? Like, what difference will it make? But then, of course, we see like what's happening with Uber, and now that there's like this whole sexual harassment scandal, now the company's like, okay, like we'll come out with a diversity report. Can you talk a little bit about why it's, assuming that you agree, why it's important that startups look at diversity from the very beginning and are transparent about it from the start?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately what I think it comes down to is the idea that you make what you measure. And that's sort of a general startup principle. If you're tracking the data, like that's where you're gonna focus in and make change. And without data, it's all just kind of hand-waving conversations. So if diversity is something that your company is serious about, even if you are just starting out, being really intentional about understanding the state of affairs at your company is the first step to being able to actually change anything, and sort of understand what you need to change. So I don't think it's ever too early to track or analyze the data. I understand why companies whose data doesn't look great don't want to put it out there, but I would say we've actually seen more companies get rewarded for kind of speaking up and telling the truth, as opposed to punished for data that doesn't look great. And when I see the most kind of negative coverage or hear people kind of condemning companies' approach, it's generally because they're not actually doing something data-driven, kind of tracking and releasing data, as opposed to because they have made a good faith effort and they haven't figured out how to move the needle yet.
Are there any companies that you think are particularly doing well when it comes to diversity and inclusion? And if so, what are they and what exactly are they doing?
I mean, I think 2 examples of companies that Code2040 has worked with for a few years now are Pandora and Slack. And both of them are tracking the data. They're investing in actually moving the needle through a number of different ways. One common pitfall that we see with companies who are not actually looking at their data is they assume that they're not getting diverse applicants, and it must be a candidate flow, an applicant flow problem, as opposed to something happening internally. And once companies actually start crunching the numbers, they often see that perhaps recruiting is one piece of the challenge, but there's actually ways in which talent is vetted, or promotions are structured, or kind of folks are made to feel included or excluded. And I think Slack and Pandora, in our experience, are both companies that have been really willing and excited to dig into those sorts of conversations and actually make changes as a result of what they've learned. Medium is another one. And Medium actually took an extra step of publishing on Medium, the way in which they totally revamped their engineering hiring as a result of digging into some assumptions they were making about kind of doing things a certain way, and where those choices were based on because we've always done this way as opposed to because it's best practice. And so those companies are all kind of moving in the right direction, and it's not always linear. I mean, this is a really hard problem. If it wasn't a hard problem, we would have solved it already. So I think companies that are making a multi-year commitment, are willing to do the hard work, are understanding of the fact that there'll be times when they move in the right direction and times when they have to course correct, are the companies that are actually starting to create change.
So you noted something about like inclusion and culture at tech companies. There, in the last year or year and a half or so, we've been hearing about companies implementing unconscious bias trainings. They've been hiring heads of diversity and inclusion. But at the same time, I've heard that those aren't always effective. What have you heard about heads of diversity as well as unconscious bias trainings?
Yeah, I think it's a mix. So regarding heads of diversity, I think what's important is that someone owns diversity and inclusion as a priority for the company, and that there are metrics against that. Often that is a head of diversity and inclusion, and if that person actually has the ability to make changes in the HR org, in the engineering org, then I think that can be really effective. Sometimes, however, companies just hire someone in that role and that person doesn't actually have any authority. And in that case, it's sort of in name only, and we don't necessarily see a lot of changes. So I think there's multiple ways to kind of approach who's the owner, as long as someone is really given power to make shifts across the org. When it comes to unconscious bias training, I think it's a mixed bag. I remember kind of sitting through one of the first ones that a big company kind of recorded and published, and being like, I was a psychology major in college, and this was my first semester. Like, this is not really the kind of tactical information that's going to tell me what to do when I show up at work tomorrow. This is like a really cool review of some fascinating studies. And I think too often companies do an unconscious bias training that is designed to prove to everyone watching it that they are biased, and then that's the end. And that's not actually effective or useful, and mostly just makes people confused and feel bad. Doing those trainings are helpful if it's a kickoff of a much more substantial intervention at a company that's followed up with changes in policy that helps people understand what their role can be as an ally. I don't see nearly enough trainings about allyship and how to be a good ally. And often what we're talking about, because of the numbers of who's working in these companies, is the people going through these trainings predominantly need to understand how to be allies. And so there are ways to follow on that sort of training that are helpful, but often it's seen as kind of a one and done.
What does being a good ally look like, in your opinion?
So I think we've seen some really good examples. I remember kind of to come back to Slack, this was years ago now, but Stuart, who's the founder and CEO, had tweeted like 5 or 6 things that were kind of calling out some aspect of bias. And I don't even remember exactly what it was. But I ran into him at a conference a few weeks later, and I introduced myself and I said, I just want to thank you for speaking up. in that moment? And he was like, oh, it really was not that big a deal. And I was like, no, it wasn't a big deal to you because of who you are and your social capital, but it actually was a really big deal to a lot of people who don't feel like they could have spoken up for themselves in that moment. So I think there are ways for, it's kind of, I grew up in New York City, so like if you see something, say something, always comes to mind for me. And I think that's kind of a basic principle of allyship. There are ways to speak up and say something when you see something that are not accusatory, they're not punishing, they're just simply making others know that you feel heard. And I'll give another example. I was playing a game of what I grew up calling Mafia, but what I hear out here is called Werewolf, which if you don't know what that is,
I don't know what either are.
It's not a big deal, but one of the premises of the game is you're all kind of role-playing, and you go to sleep at night and someone dies overnight, and then you find out in the morning. And I was with a group of people, and the narrator said, okay, everyone go to sleep, and now we're going to lynch somebody. And I immediately had this like jolt reaction of like, oh, that made me feel so uncomfortable, but what am I gonna be like the black person in the room who speaks up and is like, excuse me? And someone else immediately spoke up, a white man, and said, hey, you know what? I used to actually say that too. It's how I was taught, but I was told that it's sort of too soon for that kind of language, so let's say that they've been killed overnight instead. So kind of obscure example. If you don't know the game, it's really fun. You should check it out. But the point is that it was really simple for that person who didn't have necessarily the like, oh my gosh, they're talking about my people, I've got to speak up for my people reaction, but was like, you know what, I learned about this in the past and I'm gonna pass on this knowledge now. It took 3 seconds, it was never spoken of again, and I'm positive that person is not gonna say lynch when they play that game moving forward. So it probably saved untold people from moments of discomfort. So there are really simple things you can do, and I think it's actually pretty straightforward to train folks on that, but too often it's not a part of the conversation about inclusion.
So maybe instead of unconscious bias training, like allyship training?
I think everyone should go through allyship training, and that's not just for white men, it's for all of us. There are ways that I can learn to be a better ally for other communities that I'm not a part of and don't have a lived experience with. There are ways that I can learn to be a better ally for my own community, but I think we would all be better off if we went through allyship training.
And allyship training is a thing, like that exists?
It is a thing that exists. It's not very common, as far as I know. At Code2040, we do allyship training with our partner companies, the companies that host our fellows. And I'm sure there are other folks that do it too, but it's not very common.
Okay, interesting. So this conversation around diversity in tech has been pretty prevalent for the last few years or so. I personally don't think it's an issue that's going to go away anytime soon, but how do you think we can advance the movement? Like what do you think needs to change?
Yeah, I also think it's not going to go away anytime soon, kind of because of what we were saying earlier, that this is stemming from really deep-seated issues. This isn't a challenge that the tech industry made up. This is a challenge that the tech industry inherited. Something that Megan Smith and I used to say all the time was, it's not your fault, but it's your job. Like, it's not your fault that America is racist, but it's your job to figure out how to exist in that world and create more equity and inclusion around you. And so I think all of us need to kind of take on that mantle and understand that there are ways in which it is each of our jobs, and we can each do something, even if it's just on the scale of how you interact with people around you. Like, that's actually what builds culture, and what changes culture is the way that each of us show up when we go to work. And I also think, Code2040 is growing and expanding. We have big plans. We're actually celebrating our 5-year anniversary on Thursday, if anyone wants to go to a party. And we have big plans to grow over the next few years. So we plan to make a dent in this, but there's plenty of room for other organizations and other initiatives. Because again, I think as big as this problem may feel now, it's going to be way bigger in 10, 15, 25 years by the time we get to the year 2040.
I know that a lot of the work right now that Code2040 is doing is focused in the US, but do you envision the organization moving into like international territories?
Yeah, we get a lot of questions about expansion like that. And I think the best thing I can say is so much of what we're grappling with here in the US is because of really specific history in the US, and every country has their own set of challenges and their own historical context. And I think, at least for now, we would love to be a resource for other organizations like Code2040 in other countries, looking at other tech sectors or other industries altogether. But we're still very much in kind of the learning, growth, mastery phase of understanding how all of this fits with kind of the civil rights movement that is uniquely American, the way other countries have their own equity movements that are uniquely theirs.
So we are almost out of time, but do you have any closing words of advice for the members of this audience, maybe who are looking to really dive into diversity in tech right now?
Yeah, I'll plug a couple resources. One is a report that Megan Smith and I put out with lots of other input while we were at the White House that looks at, kind of plays with this idea that there's no playbook for getting it right, but there's definitely a playbook for not totally screwing up. So how do we raise the floor and make sure that everybody is doing kind of the basic best practices that we know about for diversity and inclusion? So that's out there on the Obama White House archive. If you Google my name and raising the floor, it should come up. And then I would also say one of Code2040's partners, a guy named Adam Pisoni, who is one of the founders of Yammer, is now running a new startup and wrote a really great Medium post about what it was like to be a white guy in an all-white guy founding team, and now that he's starting again, how he's thinking about creating a more inclusive founding team the second time around. And then the final thing I would say is it's not your fault, but it's your job. Everybody here can do something to be a better ally, to create more inclusive culture. And it just takes kind of learning about what the options are and reflecting on kind of what your place in this is to do something differently tomorrow.
All right, thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Megan.
Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.